And here I am with Richard Schumack to talk about several things pertaining to, I think, a mutually interesting topic, and that, of course, is Jesus. And we've got maybe some slightly different angles on this. I'm a New Testament scholar slash historian of the early church, a theologian into Jesus in history and thought and faith. Rich, I think you're obviously a bit the same, but you've got a slightly more distinctive angle because you've written a book called Jesus Through Muslim Eyes, which is a very intriguing thing because there is a type of Christology or a bunch of Christologies within Islam as it pertains to Jesus. There's references to Jesus in the Quran, if I'm assuming I'm right here, and a whole bunch of other traditions and things about Jesus and a certain position of attributed to Jesus in Islamic eschatologies as well. So, I mean, Richard, could you just tell us a bit about yourself and then how you came to this book idea?
Yeah, sure. Well, hi, Mike. Thanks for speaking with me about this. It's great. My background, I, as a Christian, was working in refugee ministry in Melbourne for many years. And so I just, through that, lived and works for intimately in Muslim communities for many years. And just over my time there, I didn't have a particular interest in Islam before that. I just got to know these Muslims and enjoyed living and working with them. And obviously religion came up and we just started talking about Jesus in particular. And so over time, I just worked out that when Christians and Muslims talked about faith, they tended to miss each other. Christians tended to be answering questions or presenting Jesus in ways that Muslims didn't connect, didn't compute, answered questions that Muslims weren't asking, and that went in both directions. So that led me to do some research, particularly into Muslim philosophy, Muslim mindset. I wanted to just get inside the Islamic mindset and work out, well, how can we have better conversations? So my area is philosophy, but I've written this particular book really just to think about how do Muslims think about Jesus and how can Christians and Muslims have better conversations about him.
Okay, that's excellent. That's excellent. Who is Jesus for the average Muslim? Say for the average, if I'm walking down the street or I go to my local cafe and it's run by a Muslim owner, what's their default setting about who Jesus is?
Well, virtually any Muslim who knows anything much about their faith will say that Jesus is one of our prophets. We honor him. They'll even say they love him. But in practice, so in my book, I talk about running into a friend of mine named Abdi outside a gym in Carlton in Melbourne, and he was wearing a t-shirt, and on the front it said, I love Jesus. And then on the back it said, because I am a Muslim, and he was too. And so then I asked Abdi, tell me, Abdi, what is it that you love about Jesus? What do you love about what he said? What do you love about what he did? And he sort of had a sheepish grin and just said, well, it's a free t-shirt from the mosque. Now, this is a bit instructive actually, because he would believe that. He'd say, yeah, as Muslims, we love Jesus, we honor Jesus, he's one of our prophets. But when you dig a little deeper, virtually no Muslim that I ran into knew very much about Jesus. And it's a bit understandable because the Jesus of Islam, he's a distant character. You don't get to know him very well. He's really just sort of in the background. He's alluded to sort of, particularly in the Quran, to say, well, this guy was talking about the same thing that Muhammad is. And these two religions align nicely. So he's really brought in as an expert witness, if you like. He's not focused on heavily in Islam. So Muslims don't know a lot about Jesus generally. Not even in their own tradition, they're not very familiar with all the places he turns up.
Okay. Is there any difference about the view of Jesus in different branches of Islam? Is there like a Sunni view or a Shia view, or any particular different sects have a particularized view of Jesus? Because I mean, I have come across some sort of hybrid groups like the Druze in Israel, who are kind of Jews, Christians, Muslims, and they've got a certain type of messianic faith as well, but it's a little bit maybe removed from mainstream Islam.
Yeah, so there certainly was a development over time in how people dealt with Jesus. And so the Quran is very unambiguous. The Quran very clearly declares a number of things about Jesus many of which will align with what Christians say, actually. So Jesus is a prophet, but Jesus was born of a virgin, the Virgin Mary. Interestingly, one of the chapters of the Quran is named after Mary. So
Oh, wow.
that's a very significant thing. But yeah, born of a virgin, did miracles, that he ascended to heaven, that he's going to return on Judgment Day. Very clear on all those things. Also very clear that Jesus did not die on a cross and that he was not the Son of God. And so it was very unambiguous. Jesus is a prophet. He's not what Christians say he is in terms of being divine, but he's a very important figure, and he taught Islam. That was really the message down then through the early commentators and the sort of early traditions, that when you read in the early traditions, the historians and the commentators, they took that line. But then over time, particularly as Sufism arose, which is sort of the mystical, it's not even a wing, but like mystical elements in Islamic devotion. They sort of later on, hundreds of years later, discovered Jesus and thought, particularly in the New Testament actually, and thought, wow, this guy lives a very impressive life, a very religious life, a very ascetic life. He sort of seems to be modeling the type of religious life that we aspire to. He was unmarried. He didn't have a home. He was on the road. He was very prayerful. He was entirely God devoted. And so there arose this sort of personal devotion to Jesus as a model, as a great model of what it is to be a religious person.
Yeah. My understanding of sort of Islam and Jesus is obviously that the two biggest difficulties, and you've alluded to these, is Jesus dying on the cross, right, and also the divinity of Jesus, or him being the Son of God. Hence, you've got that fairly well-known Islamic creed, that God does not beget and is not begotten, that type of thing. Is that roadblock sort of, impassable? We just have to say these are mutually different views, disagreeing views of Jesus. Is there any way to get beyond it, or is there any other common ground we can find? Is there any sort of starting point we can say, we understand what you're trying to preserve in Islam, but believing in Jesus as divine does not compromise that? Is there any way of getting between the two views?
Well, it's certainly true that if we want to talk theologically, the theology of Islam is very strongly Unitarian, very strongly the idea that God cannot be in any way complex, that the Trinity in particular is it's anathema. And so at that level, if you want to just sort of talk classical Islamic theology versus classical Christian theology, yeah, there are some exclusive truth claims that you're going to have to choose between one of them. But I don't think that necessarily means that the conversation ends, because I think the Quran seems to affirm some things about Jesus that challenge classical Islamic theology. And I think you can have good philosophical questions too about the nature of God. So I think you can keep having discussions, even interestingly from the clues you find in the Quran. You can have conversations just questioning whether things are quite that clear cut.
Okay, that's good. That's very helpful. That's very helpful.
So let me give you an example. If God is going to communicate to us at all, then in some sense he's going to have to accommodate us. He's going to have to become immanent. He's going to have to touch his creation. That's a philosophical problem, that if you want to have a very strict Unitarian view, and particularly a very high view of God's transcendence, that he can't even begin to be compromised by his creation. That just doesn't seem to work. Let me put it this way. The theology around God's transcendence doesn't seem to match with the Muslim theology of revelation. And so there's one little sort of crack, one little clue you can think, let's talk about that, because if you're going to agree to the idea that God might be immanent at all, then why not the incarnation? There's conversations you can have around that with a thoughtful Muslim.
Yeah, and that's a big issue in many religions and philosophies. In the ancient Greek world, and in Roman philosophy and religion, the way they got around that was by having either sort of junior gods who come to earth, or in Greek philosophy, particularly through the idea of the logos, the idea of a mediating principle of reason, right, that stands between both. And then Christians adapt that idea, but with a very strong mutation to the idea that the logos is part of God's own internal being, a person within the divine, within the one God, who then becomes incarnated, who becomes human, not merely a temporary epiphany of a God on earth, but God becoming one of us, which is obviously a very unique thing. But it's like a lot of philosophies have that problem of God's transcendence with his immanence.
Right.
And there's different ways of addressing it. I mean, you've got the Greeks, the Christians, Jews have their own way of dealing with it as well, particularly through, the word of the Torah, or in Aramaic, it was the Memra, which is a more hypostasized view of the word. Okay, that's really interesting
Here's
stuff.
another interesting thing too. You can come at it sort of philosophically or metaphysically, but you can also just look at the person of Jesus, which I think is actually, with the ordinary Muslim, a more useful approach. Is you can say, well, even on what we see in the Quran, Jesus doesn't seem to fit Islam. Like, why would you need a virgin-born prophet? Muhammad wasn't virgin-born. There doesn't seem to be any reason for any prophet to need to be virgin-born. Why the particular miracles that Jesus did? Why did Jesus need to ascend to heaven? That seems extraordinary. That Muhammad died and was buried. But the most extraordinary within Islam is, why is it that Jesus is the one who comes back to judge on Judgment Day? Why is he the one who destroys the Antichrist? Why is he the one that welcomes you into heaven? These seem to be extraordinary things that I wouldn't expect that. Of course, God can do whatever he wants, but there's these, and even Jesus is called the word of God and a spirit from God. Like, these don't seem to quite fit. So you can just talk about the person of Jesus and to say, wow, who is this guy? He seems to be more than just a prophet.
Oh, that's very interesting stuff. So you look at internally what's said and claimed about Jesus within the Quran, Islamic theology, and argue that it fits much better with the Christian scheme than it does internally with its own Islamic scheme.
Right, and that's essentially the argument of my book, is that he just seems a bit of a stranger that pops in and out of the Islamic tradition, but doesn't really feel at home. There are many things about him that don't quite fit, but that when you slot him over in the Christian story, it makes complete sense, particularly when you see how so many of the things that Muslims might find hard to accept, like the divinity, or even the death, the sort of sacrificial death on the cross. If you understand the Old Testament and how it all sort of fits together in a wider story, a lot of these things start to make a bit more sense.
Yeah, indeed. I was going to say, what came to my mind is there any particular one of the four Gospels that has the best utility or the best point of contact discussing Jesus with Muslims? For example, do Muslims like the gospel? Do they get the most surprised by the Gospel of Luke or the Gospel of Matthew? Is there one particular gospel that has slightly more traction than others when it comes to explaining or talking about Jesus with Muslims?
Well, that's a tricky one to answer. My hunch is that Matthew's gospel is probably the most culturally natural, partly because it talks a lot about the fulfillment of prophecy, and it's very Middle Eastern. You've got the genealogies and those sort of things. So, or even Luke's gospel would be similar. John's gospel is the one that has the most sort of highly developed Christology. So people tend to go there when the sort of Muslims will often ask, where does Jesus declare that he's God? And John's gospel sort of has the richest material for exploring that sort of stuff. But again, if you're talking the sort of deep theology, John's gospel is probably really helpful. But I think actually in practice, when I've had conversations with ordinary Muslim, it's really the stories of Jesus and the stories of Jesus about the kingdom, but also the stories about Jesus, when just the testimonies to the things he did. They're the things that appeal to the Muslim mindset, and many accounts of when I've either told a story or shown a video, and people have been in tears just with the ordinary sort of stories of Jesus. So again, you can sort of come at it from above, from the theological angle, but it's really the person of Jesus and the stories of the kingdoms that he tells that touches people's hearts. And so in a sense, you can't get that wrong, whichever gospel you get it from.
Okay, that sounds very good. Okay. Well, I mean, it sounds like it's a very interesting book you've written. What do you think would be the number one thing that would surprise readers?
Well, I think the number one thing that would surprise Christian readers, and by the way, I think this would be of interest to anyone who's interested in sort of comparative religion, but or even just the Jesus of history. But the thing that would most surprise Christian readers is just how prevalent Jesus is in Islam. And the particular beliefs about Islam, they'd be really surprised, I think, about the stories of Islam in the Quran and in the early traditions. And I think they'll find them really useful being able to speak to their Muslim friends or neighbours or workmates. I think the thing that might surprise Muslims, in some ways it's the same thing. Like I said, I was talking about Abdi before outside the gym. I think most Muslims aren't aware of the sort of richness, if that's the right word, or of the just how prevalent Jesus is, and even sort of the details of some of the stories. But I think what they might be most surprised about is what I was saying before, just how Christian that is. In their imagination, it affirms Muhammad's story or Muhammad's central message, but actually, even in the Muslim tradition, when you dig into it, like we were saying before, I think they'd be surprised just how affirming it is of the Christian story.
Yeah. I mean, as you say that, Richard, one thing that comes to my mind is, I just literally just remember this now, is about like 20 years ago, there was some piece of artwork that was being displayed. And I think it was like a statue of Jesus in a bottle of urine. And right. And there was a protest at the front of the museum, but it wasn't Christians who were protesting. There was a Muslim group who was there protesting this depiction of Christ, because I guess it was bad enough he was on a cross, but he was on a cross in a bottle of urine, and it was a type of a deliberate blasphemy as art type of a thing that was trying to push boundaries, because that's what people do.
Yeah, I remember.
But they thought they were only attacking Christian views, because that's okay, you can do that. But they're also transgressing certain Muslim sensitivities for whom who do have a certain view of Jesus in their religion. So yeah, I mean that was, for me, that was the moment I learned, 20 years ago, that Jesus really does have a prominent position in Islam. And of course, the other thing I just realized was, I think some years ago, there's a pseudepigrapha gospel called the Gospel of Barnabas, which is like an Islamic alternative to the story of Jesus, where I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, but where Jesus and Simon of Cyrene swap places. And am I right there, Richard? Am I right?
The Gospel of Barnabas is a really interesting thing, because when you talk about Jesus with Muslims, that very quickly they'll run to this idea that, well, it's this. There are the other Gospels are where you find the true Jesus, whether it's the Gospel of Thomas or the Gospel of Barnabas or the Gospel of ... And yes, there was one. Gospel of Barnabas is a very recent. It's 1500s, very recent document. The Muslims say that's the one true one. Although interestingly, educated Muslims, people who've looked into it these days, tend to realize that that's false, that it's not a true gospel.
Yeah.
But yeah, you're right. They'll make appeal to the fact that there is a historical Jesus out there.
Yeah, and I think an Iranian TV channel made a movie out of the Gospel of Barnabas some time ago, which is in terms of, if you're into Jesus movies, books, and literature more broadly, that is an interesting phenomenon.
Well, the other interesting thing is when you go back to the very early Muslim traditions, none of them were talking about the Gospel of Barnabas. In fact, they would say, no, Jesus' apostles really were Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John. And the apostles went to the same places that the Christian tradition talks about. So it's a much, much later tradition that tries to sort of reinvent Jesus. But even early Muslim traditions disagree with that. Again, that's sort of my point is, it's the Jesus of Islam. He's a stranger to many Muslims. Like, he's clearly an important figure, but we don't know him very well. But when you start to get to know him a bit better, he looks more and more and more Christian the more you look into him.
Okay, so he doesn't quite fit within the wider Islamic theology and tradition, and is more at home.
So in my book, I tell a story. So I live in part of Sydney where it's very bushy, and a couple of months ago, a parrot turned up. It's called a perfect parrot, and it's beautiful. it's one of the most gorgeous parrots. Came and sit on our deck. Came and ate seeds on from our little bird bath. And I looked it up, and its natural habitat was hundreds of kilometres away. And so I thought, this is a beautiful bird, and I love it, but it doesn't really belong here. It shouldn't be here. There's something gone wrong for it to be here. And it's that sort of sense, I think, with Jesus. He's fantastic. And even in Islam, he's very impressive, but he just doesn't quite fit. He's not really at home there.
Okay. That's excellent. That's excellent. Well, I think the book is available, obviously, through SPCK, Amazon, and I think Australian readers can probably pick up a copy at our favourite bookstore, Koorong, supporting our good friends at the Bible Society. So, well, anyway, Richard, it's been excellent chatting to you. Sounds like a very interesting book, probably something most readers have, or a lot of Christians have not thought about. And it's certainly of relevance to anyone, whether you're doing like multicultural ministry, you're into biblical studies, theology, interfaith dialogue. I mean, there's a wider range of people who would probably be interested in this book.
Yeah, I think so. Even if you're just interested in a fairly entry level look at the historical Jesus. I think I might even quote a book by a certain Mr. Bird around some of that too. So yeah, I think it's pretty accessible, and it's a good sense of even just getting a sense of the Jesus of history, but also the Jesus of devotion as well.
Okay, excellent. I think it'll be very good on the reception history of Jesus and what he means to Christians, Muslims, and all sorts of things. So, I mean, that's the kind of thing that interests me and sort of some of the people I hang out with. But anyway, okay. Well, Richard, it's been tremendous chatting with you. Thanks very much. All the best with the book, and maybe we'll chat some other time.
Absolutely. Good to speak to you, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you.